I've been playing Urban Cards recently, and it just had its 1.0 full release this week. It's a surprisingly fun roguelike card game, but is it as good as the greats like Slay the Spire and Monster Train? Let's get into it. As I mentioned, Urban Cards is a roguelite deck builder that feels similar to tabletop card games and multiplayer games like Hearthstone or Gwent. Your goal is to earn cash and reach a certain cash threshold before the enemy does. And you do that by playing cards in certain areas to either buff yourself in your cash gain or hurt the enemy in their cash gain. There are three main spots on the board for placing cards. Your workers, which make you cash and are fairly isolated from the enemy, the three business slots, which can be taken by either you or the enemy, and the streets next to the business spots, where each side can place up to 2 henchmen who fight each other, destroy enemy businesses, or steal cash directly from the enemy. Of course, there are also cards that do other effects, but these are the three main types, the three main areas of the board. As a whole, this dynamic of workers, businesses, and henchmen allows for some interesting and surprisingly deep gameplay, and it allows you to focus on different strategies depending on what synergies and mechanics you really want to focus on. I had fun in different games, either focusing on building a ton of workers, destroying their businesses as they built them, or running a steal deck where the goal was to steal whatever cash the enemy made as they made it. And on that note, there are 3 different main capitalism themed factions you can play as: a corporate faction, a tech faction, and a mixed lower income, working class, mafia kind of faction. Each has their own cards that allow for different playstyles and synergies. And within each faction, there are different starting decks. Basically, what general type of deck you're going to run is determined by your starting deck, but how you flesh it out is determined by what cards you find on your run and which cards you pick. Choosing the faction is basically choosing what cards you can find on your run, and the starting deck is, as the name suggests, what cards you actually start with. Each run consists of random events, card shops, etc., as well as the obvious card fights that lead to harder boss fights. One nice thing about the game is that at each level, you're given a choice of 3 things to do, between fights, events, etc. But you only have to do 2 of these things to progress. This is really nice because you can avoid fighting certain enemy decks that are more frustrating, or you can avoid defeating enemies that counter your deck really well. So for example, there is a mechanic of debt in the game, which you can think of as perhaps analogous to stress in Darkest Dungeon. You gain debt by using certain cards, or certain enemy abilities can give you debt as well, and it carries over across fights. If you get too much of it, you lose your run, so managing it across games, across battles, is very important. And because of that, I usually avoided fighting the Loan Shark deck, which gives you a lot of debt when you fight it, and being able to choose to not fight them is something I enjoyed. There is a tutorial in the game that teaches all the basics, but there's still a couple mechanics that take some time to figure out. So for example, you can only have 10 relics at a time, relics being items you can find or buy that give you various buffs. And so I kept buying extra relics on my earlier runs without realizing that I could only select 10 for each given fight. And like I mentioned earlier, the game feels similar to Hearthstone or Gwent or whatever multiplayer card game of choice you like to play. And your enemies are on a more level playing field in that sense because they are also using decks in the same mechanics. Unlike games like Slay the Spire or Monster Train, where obviously the enemies are not using decks, they have their own rules and moves and things like that. This also meant the developers could and did add a multiplayer mode. I didn't play it that much because I don't usually enjoy multiplayer card games that much, but it is a nice addition for those who want that, and it fits really well with the game mechanics. There are some gameplay settings you can change. So for example, I increased the game speed, as I always do with roguelike card games, and I recommend that you turn off the gold tick if you like to play as fast as possible, like I do. Otherwise, you have this mechanic where you have to slowly wait for the enemy's gold and your own gold to tick up each turn, which just kind of slows things down. And on that note, one minor thing that annoyed me about the game was the screen shake or game board shake. It was mostly fine as I was playing through it, but when I played a lot in a row, it started to get a little annoying. The board kind of shakes as you place cards and became a little distracting. I would love the option to turn that off as well, and maybe the developers will add that in the future. Another minor negative of the game is that the cash threshold can feel a little weird to reach at first. What I mean by that is, before you kind of get a feel for everything, the rounds just feel like they suddenly end, and somebody wins, hopefully you. And it feels a little weird, almost a little unsatisfying. But after I played for a while, it's something that stopped bothering me, and something that you kind of get used to because you're looking for that threshold more proactively. Still, despite these minor annoyances, I really enjoyed the gameplay as a whole, and I feel like it's a fresh and good take on the roguelike card game genre. As always, let's talk about randomness in roguelites, because RNG should provide fresh gameplay run after run, but can also just be frustrating. Because Urban Cards is a card game, there is an inherent randomness involved in what card you draw win, and that affects your gameplay. Because you only draw 1 card per turn in Urban Cards, the randomness in card drawing can feel especially important or prominent. And it also adds to the importance of draw power in this game, which is to say, drawing additional cards that let you do that, mechanics let you do that, are especially helpful in Urban Cards, even compared to other card games. That said, I usually didn't feel frustrated by this RNG in drawing cards, but it did mean that I usually avoided more niche use cards. Basically, if a card only worked in very specific combos, I was much less likely to pick it up because it was more likely to screw me over as a dead card early on in the game. One area where RNG could be particularly frustrating was during boss fights. Each boss has its own deck and combo chain, and it can sometimes be frustrating for a boss to execute its overpowered combo perfectly without you being able to stop it. So for example, one boss has a combo that lets it gain 5,000 cash in a turn if it does everything in that combo correctly. And that's just a lot of cash, something that would usually take you 5 or 10 turns to do, especially early on in the game. Of course, you can learn how to prevent these combos, and all boss combos, including this one, can be countered, but can also be a source of annoyance at times if they get their combo off perfectly by drawing the right cards before you can draw the cards you need in order to counter that. However, the game also gives you a couple lives on each run, which is great because if you get screwed over by bad draws in one game, you get another chance or two, provided you don't reach your debt cap. Additionally, while there are some cards with built-in RNG or relics with random effects, you can choose to avoid those and make decks without them if you don't want that. And then on the other hand, if you do want that, if you do want some randomized cards and stuff like that, there are options for that as well, although there's definitely a minority of cards in the game that have that built-in RNG. Finally, the RNG affects what events, enemies, and cards you get on each run. But because there's always a choice of events or which enemies you want to fight, and there's always a choice of what card you want to pick up, what card you want to buy, this mostly served as a good source of variety and not frustration. The one exception I would say is that getting certain super strong cards can really make a normal run a winning run. Some cards are just much more powerful than the other cards in the game. So as a whole, the RNG in urban cards matters in a similar way that it does for most card games, with perhaps a little more importance on the drawing order, the RNG there. However, there are enough counter RNG measures in the game that I rarely ever felt screwed over by RNG while playing it. Now let's talk about the progression and replayability in urban cards, and I like to think about two forms of progression in roguelites. First, let's talk about horizontal progression, which is progression that does not change the difficulty of the game in any way. This is the main form that progression takes in urban cards. You can explore the 3 different factions, as well as the 3 different starting decks for each one. If you want to, you can also play with a 4th random starting deck for each faction that gives you more variety in your deck by giving you completely randomized cards at the very beginning, as opposed to the set cards for each other starting deck. While you start with only one deck for each faction unlocked, you unlock the others by just playing through the game, and you also unlock more cards for each faction you can get on further playthroughs. Here is where you start to get some vertical progression, which is progression that does change the difficulty of the game in some way. While there are no strict buffs across run, there are no strict power-ups, you don't get more powerful run to run, the cards that you unlock later on are insanely better than the starting cards. So, as with some other roguelites, there's a form of soft vertical progression here, where your runs get easier because you get stronger cards that you can find after you unlock them. That being said, you can unlock all the cards pretty quickly. It's not the kind of game where you have to take 40 hours to unlock everything there is. However, one area where urban cards is really lacking compared to some other roguelike card games, it doesn't really have any form of difficulty levels to climb. There is a leaderboard, so you can do kind of score challenge if you like doing that, but there is no equivalent of Ascension levels in Slay the Spire, there is no equivalent of Covenant levels in Monster Train, there is no difficulty level to climb. It's the same difficulty every time you play the game, and so if you can clear the game consistently, there's not much else for you to do there. There's no additional challenge outside of the variety challenge of beating the game, different starting decks, or the randomized starting deck. And because of that, while I think urban cards is a good job with gameplay depth, gameplay variety, horizontal progression, the game doesn't have the same replayability as some other great roguelike card games out there because of that lack of scalable challenge. Finally, I often like to talk about the story and narrative in roguelites, but there really isn't much there for urban cards. There are some funny events and one-liners that fit the capitalism, businessy theme of the game, but there really isn't much in the way of story, which, is hardly a surprise. That's the standard for roguelites. One other thing I will say here is that I did enjoy the simple art style for what it is. I kind of liked the theme, aesthetic of the game. So what's my verdict on urban cards? Is this game worth picking up? I actually really enjoyed playing through the game, and if you're a fan of roguelike card games, I would say yes, you should look into it. It feels different than a lot of other roguelike deck builders with a more tabletop or multiplayer card game feel, and it has a nice amount of gameplay depth and build variety to go with it. However, because the game lacks some form of difficulty levels, some form of vertical progression to climb, I don't think it has the same replay value as some other roguelike card games out there, so it might not be the best game for everyone. Please like this video to help me on the algorithm, and thanks for watching.